What kind of nation survives when every empire that swore to erase it has crumbled into dust? How does a people, scattered across the earth for centuries, return to the same land their ancestors walked, speaking the same ancient language? And if history has already tried to bury them 7 times, why do they still stand? Empires have risen like tidal waves in the night, thundering across continents, crushing all in their path, only to shatter and vanish like mist. Kings have crowned themselves as living gods. Armies have marched with banners snapping in the wind. Nations have sworn in blood that Israel would be erased forever. Yet here it stands, defiant, unbroken, a narrow strip of land barely the size of New Jersey, but a name that stirs capitals, fuels conflict, and refuses to leave the stage of history. If this is your first time hearing stories like this, you need to know. We are about to uncover mysteries written thousands of years ago that are still unfolding today. So subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and walk with me into the pages of history and prophecy. The answer is older than any throne, older than any border. It is found in an ancient covenant, spoken by the Creator of heaven and earth to a wandering herdsman beneath the stars. Genesis 17:7 records God's words to Abraham, "And I will establish my covenant between me and thee, and thy seed after thee in their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be a God unto thee, and to thy seed after thee." I can almost picture that night. The desert air cool against Abraham's face, the faint bleating of sheep carried on the wind, and the endless canopy of stars stretching above him. God's voice cut through the stillness. Not a promise for a season, but for all generations to come. A covenant that would outlast pharaohs, Caesars, and presidents alike. From Abraham came Isaac, the son of promise, born to Sarah in her old age when hope had long since dried up. From Isaac came Jacob, whose name God changed to Israel, he who wrestles with God. And from Jacob came 12 sons, the 12 tribes destined to carry this promise into history. This was more than a family story. It was the birth of a nation, and God tied his own name to that nation. To understand Israel's survival, we must understand this. Its existence is not just political, not just geographical. It is theological. Israel was etched into the map of history by the will of God, and nothing, not sword, not famine, not exile, can erase what he has written. Yet there's another layer to this mystery. Israel's geography has always been both blessing and burden. A narrow land bridge between Africa, Asia, and Europe. It was the crossroads of the ancient world, where caravans once carried Arabian spices, Egyptian papyrus, and Chinese silk. Every empire wanted it, every army marched through it, and every war left scars upon Jerusalem's stones. Yet somehow, through it all, the people endured. Some claim it is simply a matter of stubborn resilience. Others say it's the result of military strategy, modern technology, and fierce patriotism. But such explanations leave one question hanging in the air, like smoke after battle. If that were all it took, why have so many other nations, stronger, richer, and more secure, vanished from the stage of history? Perhaps what makes Israel different is not strength or alliances, but a commitment beyond human reach. Yet the real question is, do we truly believe history can be written before it happens? I can almost hear it, the slow, rhythmic beat of war drums echoing through the Nile Valley. We begin in the courts of ancient Egypt, where power was measured in chariots, gold and the fear you could carve into your enemies' hearts. Pharaoh sat on his throne, wrapped in linen and pride, the serpent crown gleaming in the torchlight. In his mind, Egypt was the center of the world, and no slave-born people would ever rise to challenge it. Yet he had a problem, one that no fortress wall could contain. The Hebrews, descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, had grown in number and strength in the land of Goshen. Exodus 1-9 records Pharaoh's fear. Behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. His solution was ruthless. Enslave them, break their backs with labor, and kill every newborn Hebrew boy. But the God of Israel was watching. The cry of his people rose from the brick pits and fields, and he sent a deliverer, Moses, armed not with an army, but with signs and wonders. The plagues of Egypt weren't just disasters. They were direct strikes against Egypt's gods. The Nile turned to blood. The sun blotted out in darkness. The firstborn struck down in the dead of night. I imagine the terror in Pharaoh's palace when news came that the god of slaves had humiliated the gods of Egypt. The climax came at the Red Sea. Egypt's war chariots thundered in pursuit, the spray of salt water on their faces, confident they would crush this fleeing people. But the sea itself rose up in defiance, parting for Israel and then crashing down to swallow Pharaoh's army whole. Egypt's empire, unshaken for centuries, learned that day, you cannot fight against the will of the Almighty and win. Centuries later, another empire rose in brutal strength. Assyria. Their armies were feared across the ancient world. Siege engines rumbling toward city gates. Soldiers with faces painted in war patterns, their cruelty legendary. In 722 BC, they swept into the northern kingdom of Israel like a storm, capturing its cities and scattering the 10 tribes across foreign lands. To any observer, it was the end of the story. A nation without land, without its unity, was destined to dissolve into history's shadows. But God had left a remnant. The southern kingdom of Judah remained, and with it, the covenant's thread still held. Assyria's kings could carve their victories in stone, but they could not erase the name of Israel from God's plan. Then came Babylon, rising like a golden colossus under King Nebuchadnezzar. Their armies marched on Jerusalem in 586 BC, tearing down the temple, burning the city, and carrying Judah's people into exile. The psalmist's words from the rivers of Babylon carry the ache of that moment. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? Psalm 137:4. Yet even in captivity, prophets like Jeremiah and Daniel spoke hope. Jeremiah foretold a return after 70 years, and history records that it happened exactly as God had said. Babylon, once thought unshakable, fell to the Persians. And the people of Israel came home to rebuild their city and temple. But in the Persian court lurked another threat: Haman. His hatred for the Jews was so consuming that he plotted their extermination across the empire. It was a plan sealed with the king's authority and backed by the law of the Medes and Persians, which could not be revoked. Yet God had placed Esther, a Jewish woman, on the throne as queen. Through her courage, the plot was exposed. Haman was hanged on the gallows he had built for others, and the Jewish people were saved, a victory still celebrated each year at Purim. The next great threat came from the Seleucid Empire under Antiochus Epiphanes. His goal was not just political domination, but spiritual erasure, forcing the Jews to abandon their laws, desecrating the temple with pagan sacrifices. Many died, rather than bow to false gods. But the Maccabees rose in rebellion, and by God's providence, they recaptured and purified the temple. The menorah burned again, its light a symbol that heaven had not abandoned Israel. Rome was next, ironclad, relentless. In AD 70, under General Titus, they laid siege to Jerusalem, destroying the Second Temple and scattering the Jewish people. Emperor Hadrian later tried to wipe their identity from history, renaming the land Palestine and forbidding Jews from even entering Jerusalem. It was one of the longest exiles in human history, a people without a homeland for nearly 2 millennia. Through the Middle Ages, they wandered from kingdom to kingdom, often welcomed for their skills, only to be turned into scapegoats when famine, plague, or war struck. In Spain, the Inquisition offered a cruel choice: convert, flee, or die. In Eastern Europe, pogroms unleashed mobs upon Jewish communities, leaving streets stained with blood and dreams shattered. And then came the most systematic attempt of all: the Holocaust. Adolf Hitler's Third Reich sought not just conquest, but the total extermination of the Jewish people. 6 million were murdered, men, women, and children, gassed in camps like Auschwitz, shot in forests, starved behind ghetto walls. Entire towns disappeared from the map. It was evil on a scale the modern world had never seen. Yet even that horror failed. 3 years after the Holocaust ended, the unthinkable happened. On May 14, 1948, Israel was reborn as a nation. The dry bones of Ezekiel's vision began to rise, flesh and breath returning after 2,000 years. The next day, armies from 5 Arab nations invaded, determined to strangle the newborn state in its cradle. Against all odds, outnumbered, outgunned, Israel survived. 7 times in history, the powers of the earth had tried to erase Israel. 7 times they failed. Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, the Seleucids, Rome, and Nazi Germany, all reduced to chapters in history books. Israel still walks the pages of today's news. I think of Jeremiah 31:35-36, where God declares that as long as the sun, moon, and stars remain, Israel will never cease to be a nation before him. And history seems to agree. For all their armies, laws, and decrees, the empires of man could not break what God had spoken. When the strongest powers the world has ever known have tried and failed to erase a single nation, does that point to chance, or to a hand moving behind the scenes, unseen but unstoppable? The year was 1948, and the world was still reeling from the ashes of the Second World War. Cities lay in ruins, empires had crumbled, and millions of lives had been swallowed by the machinery of war. In Europe, the smoke from crematorium chimneys had barely faded. 6 million Jews had been murdered in the Holocaust. Entire families had been erased, their names reduced to fading ink in abandoned registries. And yet, the unthinkable happened. On May 14, 1948, in a modest hall in Tel Aviv, David Ben-Gurion declared the birth of the modern state of Israel. I imagine the moment, an electric stillness hanging over the room as the words were spoken. Outside, the streets were filled with a mix of dancing and tears, the kind of joy only born out of decades of longing. But this joy had no time to settle. Less than 24 hours later, Israel's newborn cry was met with the roar of war. Armies from 5 nations, Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and Iraq, launched a coordinated invasion. The goal was clear: annihilation. The War of Independence, 1948 to 1949. Israel had no fully organized military, only a patchwork of militias, farmers with rifles, and Holocaust survivors still haunted by the camps. They had little heavy weaponry, no air force to speak of, and they were surrounded on all sides by armies with far greater numbers and resources. Logic said they had no chance. Yet somehow, against overwhelming odds, they survived. Not just survived. They secured more territory than the UN's original partition plan had granted. The war ended with Israel not erased, but firmly planted. Was it military skill? Yes. Was it resourcefulness? Absolutely. But was there something else? A momentum history itself could not stop. The Six-Day War, 1967. 19 years later, the storm gathered again. Tensions with neighboring Arab states had been simmering for years. In May 1967, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser moved troops into the Sinai Peninsula, expelled UN peacekeepers, and closed the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping, a move Israel had long declared a red line. Syria and Jordan mobilized their armies. The Arab press promised the liquidation of the Zionist entity. June 5, 1967, Israel struck first in an air operation that military historians still study in awe. The Israeli Air Force destroyed most of Egypt's air force on the ground within hours. Over the next 6 days, Israel fought on 3 fronts, defeating Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. When the dust settled, Israel controlled the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights, the West Bank, and, most significantly, East Jerusalem. For the first time in nearly 2,000 years, Jews could once again pray freely at the Western Wall. Soldiers wept as they touched the ancient stones, their uniforms dusty from battle, their rifles slung across their backs. This was more than military victory. It was a psychological and spiritual turning point. But it also carried a heavy cost. The territories Israel now held would become the focal point of decades of dispute, negotiation, and bloodshed. The Khartoum Resolution and the 3 No's. In the wake of their defeat, leaders of 8 Arab nations met in Khartoum, Sudan, in August 1967. The outcome was uncompromising. No peace with Israel. No recognition of Israel. No negotiations with Israel. With these words, any hope for immediate reconciliation was buried. The message was not simply political, it was existential. The Arab states were not prepared to live alongside a Jewish state in the Middle East, and so Israel found itself in a paradox. They had won the war decisively, yet the war for legitimacy had only grown sharper. The Yom Kippur War, 1973, October 6, 1973. It was Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. Across Israel, streets were quiet, synagogues were full, radios were silent, and then the attack came. Egypt and Syria launched a surprise assault, catching Israel off guard. On the southern front, Egyptian forces crossed the Suez Canal under cover of darkness, overwhelming the Bar-Lev line. In the north, Syrian tanks poured into the Golan Heights. For the first days, it looked as if Israel might lose everything. The casualty lists grew. Families waited by radios for updates that often never came. Entire battalions were surrounded, but Israel fought back, rallying with a determination that felt as much spiritual as it was strategic. Within weeks, the tide had turned. Israeli forces had crossed the Suez Canal into Egyptian territory and were within striking distance of Damascus. The war ended with a ceasefire, but the cost was heavy. Over 2,600 Israeli soldiers dead, thousands more wounded. The shock of how close they had come to destruction would reshape Israeli military doctrine for decades. A rare peace, Egypt and Israel, 1979. Out of this cycle of war came an unexpected breakthrough. In 1979, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin signed a peace treaty brokered by U.S. President Jimmy Carter at Camp David. Egypt became the first Arab country to officially recognize Israel. In return, Israel withdrew from the Sinai Peninsula, a land rich in oil and of immense strategic value. It was a decision that baffled some military minds. Why give up hard-won territory? But for Israel, it was proof that they were willing to trade land for lasting peace if the other side was willing to meet them halfway. Sadat paid with his life. In 1981, he was assassinated by extremists who saw his peace with Israel as betrayal. But the treaty has held to this day, a rare island of stability in the shifting tides of the Middle East, the Oslo Accords and the disappointment. 1993 to 2000. The 1990s brought another flicker of hope. The Oslo Accords aimed to lay the groundwork for peace between Israel and the Palestinians. Israel recognized the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, as a representative of the Palestinian people, and the PLO recognized Israel's right to exist. Yet the promise unraveled. In 2000, at Camp David, Israel offered a plan granting the Palestinians over 95% of the West Bank and all of Gaza, along with a capital in East Jerusalem. The offer was rejected. Soon after came the Second Intifada, waves of suicide bombings, shootings, and rocket attacks that killed hundreds of Israeli civilians and soldiers. For many Israelis, this cemented a bitter conclusion. Even generous offers could be met with bloodshed, not peace. Iran and the modern threat matrix. Today, Israel faces a new kind of battlefield, one that stretches beyond its immediate borders. Iran has repeatedly declared its intention to wipe Israel off the map. This is not empty rhetoric. Iran funds and arms Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza, groups that have launched thousands of rockets into Israeli towns and cities. It's a conflict fought not just with tanks and jets, but with tunnels, cyber warfare, and propaganda. Hezbollah's missile arsenals are hidden in civilian areas. Hamas digs beneath the streets of Gaza, preparing for surprise attacks. Israel, in turn, develops cutting-edge defense systems like Iron Dome, intercepting rockets in the sky before they can kill. But even with advanced technology, every siren that wails in Tel Aviv or Ashkelon carries a reminder. The war is never far away. Children know the seconds they have to run to a shelter. Parents keep one ear tuned for that warning tone. The prophetic undercurrent. Jeremiah 31:35-37 is often read as poetry, but for Israel, it is geography, politics, and survival all at once. If those ordinances depart from before me, then the seed of Israel shall also cease from being a nation before me forever. History seems to echo that sentiment. In 1948, in 1967, in 1973, and in every war since, logic said Israel should have fallen. Numbers, resources, and global opinion often tilted against them. Yet, here they are. Is it possible that we are witnessing not just history, but prophecy unfolding in real time? And if so, what does that mean for the future? Not just of Israel, but of the nations around it. A fragile future. The reality is complex. Israel's military victories are real, but so are the political challenges. The more territory they gain, the more the world questions their legitimacy. The more they defend themselves, the more they are accused of aggression. Every move is magnified in the court of global opinion. Inside Israel, debates rage. how to balance security with morality, survival with justice, faith with diplomacy. Outside, alliances shift like desert sands. Some nations draw closer, others keep their distance, waiting to see how history will turn. But through it all, the question remains the same. The one that began in 1948 and has never truly been answered. How long can a nation stand when surrounded by enemies who refuse to recognize its right to exist? If military logic alone says Israel should have fallen many times over, yet it still stands, are we looking at coincidence? Or the unshakable unfolding of something written long before our time? I have taken you through the ruins of empires, through the halls of Pharaoh's palaces, through the siege towers of Rome, through the shadows of the Holocaust's barbed wire. We have seen Israel surrounded, battered, and yet somehow still breathing. But the Bible whispers, and at times shouts, that the story is not over. What has happened is only the prelude. There is one last act still to come, a chapter already written, waiting for its appointed hour. The prophet Zechariah saw it long before any modern war, long before the name Israel returned to the maps. He wrote with unsettling clarity, "Behold, the day of the Lord is coming, for I will gather all the nations to battle against Jerusalem. The city shall be taken, the houses rifled, and the women ravished. Half of the city shall go into captivity, but the remnant of the people shall not be cut off from the city." Zechariah 14:1-2, NKV. It is a vision that cuts like a blade. The nations are not a metaphor. They are the world's powers drawn by motives they may think are political, economic, or ideological, but in reality, moved by a far older current. I imagine it not as an ancient clash of swords, but as a siege born in our own time. The thrum of drones circles the skies over the Mount of Olives. The glow of satellite imagery paints the walls of command centers continents away. Tank columns grind through the Judean hills, the dust mixing with the scent of diesel. In the streets of Jerusalem, the air is thick with smoke. The sound of sirens merges with the distant rumble of artillery. This will not be another skirmish in a long list of wars. It will not be settled by diplomacy or ceasefire. This will be the world, in all its collective strength, pressing its heel against the very plan of God. The city chosen to bear his name will be the target. For a moment, it will seem as though the prophecy's darkest line has come to pass. Jerusalem breached, her people scattered again, the hope of generations on the edge of extinction. But Zechariah's vision does not end there. In the very next breath, the horizon changes. Then the Lord will go forth and fight against those nations, as he fights in the day of battle. V3. This is not allegory. The prophets speak of an intervention so sudden, so decisive, that it will split history in two, and then comes the image so staggering that it defies quiet reading. And in that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, which faces Jerusalem on the east. And the Mount of Olives shall be split in two, from east to west, making a very large valley. V4. Think of it, the very ground trembling under the weight of his return. The Mount of Olives, where Jesus once wept over Jerusalem, where he ascended in silence before the eyes of his disciples, will feel the thunder of the King's feet. But this time, he comes not to be mocked, not to be crucified, but to reign. The mountain will tear apart, forming a path of escape for his people, a sign that the tide has turned. The book of Revelation mirrors this moment. John describes a rider on a white horse, eyes like flames, wearing many crowns, His robe is dipped in blood, and the armies of heaven follow him. This is not a distant spiritual metaphor. It is the warrior Messiah, the long-awaited fulfillment of promises stretching back to Abraham. For Israel, that moment will bring more than military deliverance. It will bring revelation. Zechariah writes elsewhere, "And I will pour on the house of David and on the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and supplication. Then they will look on me, whom they pierced." Zechariah 12:10. Picture it. In the middle of a war where all seems lost, the sky tears open. The one they see carries wounds in his hands and feet. Recognition sweeps through the city like a wave. Generations of longing and rejection, of prayers spoken without knowing who would answer, all meet in one breathtaking instant. The mourning will be deep, like a parent grieving an only child, but it will be cleansing. It will not end in despair, but in reunion. From that moment the story changes. Zechariah says, "The Lord shall be king over all the earth. In that day it shall be, the Lord is one, and his name one." V9. The city that has been fought over for millennia will become the seat of a reign that cannot be overthrown. Isaiah saw it centuries earlier. He described nations streaming to Jerusalem, not with armies, but with open hands. They will come to learn his ways, to walk in his paths. Swords will be hammered into plowshares, spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. Isaiah 2:4. Micah echoed it, painting the picture of a world where fear is gone, where every man sits under his vine and fig tree, with none to make them afraid. It is a world we have never known, but it is the one the prophets insist will come. And so every war Israel survives now, every headline about rising tensions, every coalition forming for or against her. These are not random ripples. They are the slow, steady current toward a day already set in God's calendar. If this is true, then the future is not uncertain. It is simply unrevealed to us. When I read these prophecies, I don't just see theology. I see the streets of Jerusalem I've walked in my mind 100 times, the cobblestones slick with rain, the scent of bread from market stalls, the murmur of prayers at the western wall. I think of how fragile peace has always been here, how quickly joy can turn to mourning, and I think of what it will be when the one who promised peace finally takes his seat in the city of peace. But prophecy does more than promise a future. It asks a question in the present. If the ending is already written, then every event, victory or loss, is moving toward that ending. That means we, too, are moving toward it. Perhaps the greater question is not whether these words will come true. They will. The greater question is whether we will recognize them when they do. Will we see in the chaos the shape of the plan? Will we stand in the valley when the mountain splits, knowing the King has come? Or will we be like those who, even with the truth before them, refuse to believe? And maybe that is the real choice the prophecy gives us. Not to decide whether it will happen, but to decide where we will stand when it does. I have told you of kingdoms and wars, of victories that defy reason, and defeats that became the soil for rebirth. We have walked together from the tents of Abraham to the streets of modern Jerusalem, from the scrolls of prophecy to the breaking news of our own time. And still, the heart of the matter remains. Israel lives. Not because the world allows it, not because its armies are the strongest or its alliances the most secure. It lives because the one who spoke light into the darkness made a covenant and has never broken his word. If God has kept his promises to Israel through 4,000 years of exile, return, and survival, then we must ask ourselves, what does that say about the promises he has made to us? This is more than history. It is a mirror. The same faithfulness that has preserved Israel is the faithfulness that can hold us when the ground beneath us shakes. The same hands that gathered a scattered people from the corners of the earth can gather a heart broken by grief, a soul wandering in doubt. I think about the imagery God chose to make his point. In Jeremiah 31:35-36, he ties his covenant to the laws of nature. Thus says the Lord, who gives the sun for a light by day, the ordinances of the moon, and the stars for a light by night. If those ordinances depart from before me, says the Lord, then the seed of Israel shall also cease from being a nation before me forever. It is his way of saying, I would sooner tear down the stars than tear up my promises. And if that is true for Israel, it is true for every word he has spoken over our lives. Israel's story is not just one of survival. It is one of purpose. Every time they rise from the ashes, the world is reminded that history is not ruled by chance, but by a sovereign hand. And that truth demands a response from us. We live in an age where truth is questioned, where faith is dismissed as weakness, where the tides of culture shift so quickly, it can feel like we are losing our footing. But Israel stands as a lighthouse in the storm, a living testimony that God's word endures, even when surrounded by waves determined to drag it under. If you have ever wondered whether God sees you, whether his promises can be trusted, look at Israel. If he has kept his word to them through exile, persecution, and the might of empires, then he will keep his word to you. And yet, there is a warning woven into this hope. Prophecy tells us the days ahead will not be easy. For Israel, or for the world, there will be a final storm, a gathering of nations, a moment when the darkness seems to win. But the ending is already written. The King will come. The mountain will split. Justice will roll down like a river, and peace will cover the earth like the sea. When that day comes, we will not be able to claim we didn't know. We will only be able to say where we chose to stand. So here is the value I hope you carry from this story. God's faithfulness is not an abstract idea. It is an unshakable reality. And his covenant is not fragile. It is the backbone of history. And here is the message I hope will stay with you. If you anchor your life to the promises of God, you are fastening yourself to something that cannot be moved, no matter how fierce the storm becomes. Israel's existence is proof that the author of history is still writing, and if he has written their survival into the last page, then you can trust him with your story too.